My name is Natalie Click. I grew up in Melbourne, Florida. It feels like a very stereotypical Floridian city. There's lots of palm trees, and if you drive a couple miles west, you're in a swamp. It was pretty normal for me to just go to the store with my mom, and there would be a retention pond, and there's just, a 12-foot alligator chilling on the side of the bank. And it was totally normal for me to just walk outside in my pajamas and see a rocket launch across the sky. Melbourne itself is in the shadow of the Kennedy Space Center. There is a lot of defense and aerospace work in this city. It was kind of a hub for a lot of the major engineering firms, Harris, Northrop Grumman, NASA. It employed hundreds, if not thousands, of engineers. In the defense industry, it kind of felt like it was a roller coaster. The companies depend on contracts, and the contracts can be very fickle. They bring in a bunch of engineers. When those contracts ended, if they didn't have more contracts to fill the place, then they would lay off a bunch of engineers. My dad personally was very fortunate in that he had a very steady job for many years. I remember growing up and he might come home one day and be like, oh yeah, so-and-so, my cubicle buddy, got laid off today. And then, maybe a couple years down the road, it happened again. Oh, Natalie, do you remember so-and-so? Her dad works with me. Yeah, I remember them, Dad. Yeah, well, he's working at this company now. His family could use some prayers that he could find another job to support them. The way that my dad would talk about the industry, the things that I have personally seen, it kind of seems like that's the norm. That's the norm.
That roller coaster Natalie's describing, it's the reality for a lot of workers in the defense industry. Whether the town they live and work in is a defense hub like Melbourne, or has its entire economy resting on the shoulders of just one defense contractor, there's a clear link between defense spending and jobs. I'm Lacey Healy, and today on Things That Go Boom, we ask, is defense spending really a good way to create middle-class jobs? And if it is, does that mean that if Biden begins to shift some money away from defense, or even just away from some of the big weapon systems that a lot of these towns are tasked to build, that some of those middle-class jobs might get cut? What if there's a better option? One that fits more closely with Biden's plans for the middle class.
Experiencing the news each day can feel like a journey. With Up First from NPR, it doesn't have to be. Welcome to 15 easy minutes of breaking news, clarity on international and national affairs, all handed over not from some floating voice in the sky, from us, Layla, A, Steve, and me, Rachel. Start your day informed. Subscribe to Up First wherever you get your podcasts.
The U.S. defense budget is, to use a technical term, ginormous. You know the $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill that's working its way through Congress?
After years and years of infrastructure week, we're on the cusp of an infrastructure decade.
The grand total of that plan will add to the discretionary budget. It's expected to be about $415 billion over 10 years, which sounds like a lot. I mean, it is a lot. And yet, it is $300 billion less than what Biden wants to spend on defense just next year, on just the Pentagon. Altogether, almost half of what Biden requested in his 2022 budget is reserved for national security, $753 billion. By comparison, the major new climate initiatives that Biden's promoting, those are getting less than 1% of his budget proposal. A quick reminder here that we're only talking about discretionary spending. Mandatory spending for things like Medicare and Social Security is, well, mandatory. And it makes up a slightly bigger slice of the whole $6 trillion federal budget pie, which also includes interest on the national debt. But the point is, $750 billion a year could pay for a lot of things that aren't defense. Of course, some folks will say that if we spend less on national security, we'll be less safe. But I actually think that the outrage that surrounds this topic has more to do with something I learned on my first day at a new job. I was the budget analyst at the Center for Arms Control and Nonproliferation, and the guy who had the job before me, he took me aside. He said he knows without a doubt that there are some cases where reducing the defense budget in order to fund other priorities, it makes perfect sense on paper. But there's this one sticky thing, he said. People's livelihoods depend on the policies you're going to recommend. There are a lot of real people whose jobs are on the line. It's the trickiest conversation you'll ever have. And he was right.
I 100% empathize and understand when people are grateful to have a job.
This is Taylor Barnes.
I am a post-Great Recession millennial, so we're very into issues of employment and economic precarity. Those things are not abstract to us.
She's an Atlanta-based journalist, and she reports on what the actual people who live and work in defense communities think about things. Like, does spending money on defense actually create jobs, like politicians say it does?
So yes, it does, and I think that's something important to reckon with. I mean, people, of course, make middle-class careers out of this, often better than their civilian counterparts.
But there's a catch.
Yes, it does create jobs, but, not actually a ton, and it's dropping. So, for example, I've used figures in my reporting from the National Defense Industrial Association about employment in the private defense sector, and they put that at about 1 million jobs in the U.S. nowadays. And it's a huge drop from the Reagan-era boom of defense spending in the 80s, when that was well over 3 million.
Taylor says that economists have also pointed out that if politicians' goal is to create jobs, defense isn't the best industry to turn to. Not even close.
Compared to almost any other way the government can spend money to create jobs, the defense industry is basically one of the poorest ways to do that.
She cited a landmark study that looked at how many jobs get created by different industries per $1 million of government spending. And what industry did they find creates the fewest jobs? Defense. You actually get 42% more jobs from the same investment if you put it toward an industry like clean energy or infrastructure.
It's for a few reasons. One, because it's the defense industry is capital intensive, meaning less money goes straight to salaries. Two, it's prone to outsourcing in ways that, for example, education is not.
Taylor says a lot of defense jobs are, in many ways, good jobs, but they're not necessarily stable.
There are job losses in the defense industry that are not happening just because the needle's moving up and down in the defense budget. However, what's also happening, and this is something I can see since I'm here in the South, is that there's some movement to abandon unionized workforces and come to quote-unquote right-to-work states here in the South.
I wanted to get an expert's take on all of this, so I spoke to an old friend who knows the subject inside and out.
My name is Miriam Pemberton. I'm an associate fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. I've been studying defense transition for decades, and now I'm working on a book. There really are some serious holes in the argument that we have to spend ever greater amounts on the military budget to create jobs.
Miriam says that even though it's not a great move economically, lawmakers just keep using defense to pump more money into their districts.
The Senate Armed Services Committee just voted to spend more money on the defense budget than even the Pentagon asked for. And that will bring our military budget higher than at any time since World War II, if they succeed with that.
There's probably no project that shows this phenomenon and its consequences more clearly than the F-35.
The most expensive weapon system in the history of humankind.
The F-35 lining, initially intended as a means of cutting the costs and improving the efficiency of any modern military's arsenal, has now become the symbol of the bloated military-industrial complex. Estimates put the program's lifetime cost at some $1.727 trillion. Just let that sink in for a moment.
Each plane costs upwards of $38,000 an hour to fly. And the pilots' helmets, they each cost more than a Ferrari. But they're also just kind of bad planes. The F-35 still has around a half dozen critical design deficiencies. Just Google Pentagon boondoggle and it's likely to dominate your top hits.
It's inherently a terrible airplane because it's an airplane built for a dumb idea. You can't start with a bad idea and get a good airplane.
That's Pierre Spray, one of the designers of the F-16. And the bad idea he's talking about is the very premise that inspired the F-35's development. The idea that one plane design could serve the needs of every branch of the military. In reality, he says, the design is a bad fit for all of them. But, of course, Lockheed Martin defends the project. It is stealthy, they say. And the price tag isn't outlandish when you consider all of the plane's cutting-edge custom features. Plus, earlier this year, an executive said that they're pretty sure they can get the operating cost down to just $25,000 an hour. And those $400,000 helmets, well, they're loaded with cameras and sensors and displays. Each pilot actually gets their helmet custom fitted down to the millimeter. Although, unfortunately, the helmet fit is so snug that anytime a pilot gets a haircut, the whole helmet has to be refitted, which is a 2-day process. Every so often, as recently as this past spring, Congress threatens to cut its losses and pull the plug on the whole program. But the vote never passes. For one main reason: jobs. Here's Taylor again.
A key part of its political staying power is its job creation narrative, and Lockheed Martin appears to understand that because not only do they promote job creation, they run a whole website dedicated to showing you where the jobs are. It's a map of the U.S. that you can click on and see what they claim are jobs related to F-35 production.
According to Lockheed Martin, the F-35 program employs 146,000 workers across 46 states. And since the jobs the F-35 creates are spread among so many states and so many voting districts, it's almost inconceivable that it would ever lose congressional support. In April, even Bernie Sanders voted to extend the program for the jobs.
We right now have the F-16 in Burlington. It employs hundreds of people. It provides a college education for hundreds of people. So for me, the question is not whether we have the F-35 or not. It is here. The question for me is whether it is located in Burlington, Vermont, or whether it is located in Florida. That's the issue.
For the record, the F-35s ended up being housed on bases in Vermont and Florida.
There's a caucus in Congress. It's called the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter Caucus, and it has 130 members. And all of them have signed a letter saying we need to build more F-35s than even the Pentagon wants. That is not a model of industrial efficiency. That's all about protecting these contractors, giving them political contributions to make sure they are on board, putting contracts in their districts to create political pressure.
Miriam says that this political engineering tactic of dispersing contract work across many, many congressional districts, it came about after the Cold War.
The Pentagon was certainly doing it, has been doing it all along, but the contractors really got into the act after the Cold War when they really were pulling out all the stops to make sure that military spending rose again. And so this was their principal tool for doing that.
And that's fascinating that you say after the Cold War, because we also have had this very interesting foreign policy post-Cold War that has sort of remained very militarized, some might say. Do you think contractors have played a central role in driving that forward?
Oh, I do. Yeah, absolutely. That's their MO.
Lockheed Martin isn't alone. Each of the U.S.'s major defense contractors have done an extremely good job at making themselves impossible to fire. But let's imagine for a moment that the defense budget does get reduced. And the money, it goes to fund civilian projects, the kind that take a lot of engineering and manufacturing know-how. Well, these defense contractors, they could bid on non-military projects too, right? Miriam says they've tried.
When the defense budget declines, some of them do try to get into civilian areas, and sometimes they're successful. But the times when they're not successful is when they simply try to use military contracting practices in the commercial area where it doesn't work. When you talk about defense conversion, the poster child that always comes up as clearly demonstrating that contractors can't go into commercial civilian production was back in the 70s. The budget came down after the Vietnam War, and Boeing, the largest maker of military planes and civilian planes both, decided it was going to try to build light rail cars, and it got a contract to do that. And it applied the military practice called concurrency, which means...
That's when you start building the thing while it's still in research and development. In other words, before you've worked out all the bugs.
We'll figure this out as we go along. That's common practice. Mm-hmm. But you can't really do that in the civilian and commercial areas. So they built these light rail cars and put them on the streets before they were fully tested, and they broke down. And so those stories were plastered across the newspapers to see how military contractors can't get into commercial areas.
So what would it take for the defense industry to make a change and to get it right? We'll find out after the break. And we'll ask if the people who work within the industry would even want that to happen. To use Natalie's phrase, it's a bit of a roller coaster.
I'd like to call the November 17th, 2020 meeting of the Buncombe County Commission to order. Thank you all for being with us this evening. Let's begin our meeting with the Pledge of Allegiance. Please rise and join us.
So last year, locals in Asheville, North Carolina were surprised to find out that their county officials had secretly negotiated what's called an economic development deal, a nearly $100 million value, with a division of Raytheon. Raytheon being one of the world's largest defense contractors. It has a division called Pratt & Whitney that makes engine parts for military aircraft and civilian aircraft. By the time the public learned about it, it was basically too late.
This public hearing regarding the Pratt & Whitney Economic Development Agreement, and Tim...
We got one single hour-long opportunity to offer public comment.
Will get us started.
This was sort of a staid, procedural-looking county commission meeting during COVID, where these county commissioners are sitting on a little diocese, wearing face masks, socially distanced. People who were pro-plant got to come in and give a PowerPoint presentation, detail the expected job creation.
The vision for the project is to create a world-class turbine airfoil production facility that represents a $650 million total potential investment in the county. It will generate 800 total projected jobs.
And then in this sort of indication of the uproar to come, the county commission chair says something along the lines of, okay, it's time to open it to public comment.
You need to hold the public hearing on consideration.
There's quite a bit of interest in this one. It could take a while.
A pretty significant number of folks who've signed up, so this will take a while.
And the public's allowed to call into the meeting. You just hear these disembodied voices over the intercom.
You are live now.
Good evening, commissioners.
Furious that their county government would negotiate a deal with a company like Raytheon.
How does the promise of 800 jobs justify?
People spoke about the war in Yemen.
Another wedding in Yemen. Another fighter aircraft carrying a missile. Another 21 innocent
civilians. The impact of a 5-lane bridge over the French Broad.
It went on for an hour. It was totally raucous.
I never want to hear again that there is not enough money to fund regional public transportation.
One woman started praying on the phone through tears.
And what does the Lord require of you?
Praying that the county commissioners would make the correct decision.
And to walk humbly with your God.
People were angry. There was a hairdresser who called in. There was a guy who worked at the local solar installation company.
The old Gentry Christmas tree farm.
And they were using their evening to sound off about it. Even though the vast majority of the public, everyone but one person, opposed the deal, then the commissioners went ahead and unanimously approved it.
All in favor of the motion?
But that's why it sort of spawned this local resistance group that has sprung up to resist it.
Any opposed? Okay. Thank you again to all the county staff.
Asheville is a pretty liberal town, so maybe it's no surprise to hear that the folks on the ground aren't exactly psyched to welcome a big new defense contractor. But Taylor's seen similar pushback from locals in more conservative towns like Huntsville, Alabama, a big defense community. And even in liberal Asheville, not everyone wants to chase Raytheon out. If you're an Ashevillean looking for a good middle-class job, you might understandably sign on. Defense wages are pretty good. But between the instability of the industry and increasing threats to the existence of defense unions, some workers are hungry for better options.
What I just think is sort of important to point out is what it would take to transition the defense workforce is an alternative. And very thankfully for that prospect, there is an alternative right now.
Not only is this something that is going to help our planet, but also put food on the table.
It's about growing this economy and protecting our families by reducing greenhouse gases.
These are the industries that will reduce the pollution that harms our health and fuels our climate crisis. And in the process, they'll boost the economy and create good jobs in every community.
There's the existential crisis and great need to address climate change, which requires a workforce that is already an overlapping one with the defense workforce.
The idea of problem solving is the same. You're probably going to use Python or C++. You're going to use your same coding languages. Pretty much every engineering industry uses CAD or some sort of 3D modeling software.
I have heard frustrations about, hey, why are we making more F-35s than the government even wants? And I think there's a certain pride in innovation and being able to be part of, the next step. I think there are many people who see it as a very natural transition. For example, I've profiled an engineer who worked on fighter jets and cruise missiles, who then adapted his understanding of jet engine technology to create a new type of wind energy technology that's like basically a shoebox-sized wind turbine. For him, this is not a radical identity change. It was natural.
And renewable energy was a natural fit for Natalie, too. She studied engineering at University of Alabama, Huntsville because, she just wanted to make the world better. Today, she's researching how to keep old solar panels from getting chucked in the landfill by making them profitable to recycle. But she thinks the ideological do-gooder aspect of working in green technology may not appeal to some of her former classmates.
I definitely feel like an outcast for being an engineer who wanted to go into renewables instead of going into defense. So for my undergraduate institution, UAH, it was very defense heavy. And the vibe I sort of got was, oh, Natalie, what you're doing with solar is pretty cool. Yeah, I guess the environment is important, but I'm interested in blowing stuff up.
She says they probably would get on board if the price was right.
If I was to go back to Huntsville, I would be able to say, hey, if you can get paid the exact same amount of money to work on rockets or work on renewable energy, would you consider going to renewable energy? I think that conversation would be a lot easier.
Now Natalie's a PhD student at Arizona State University. But she says her job prospects and paychecks will be slim compared to her classmates working in defense, which is one reason why some policy analysts and labor unions aren't convinced that transitioning from defense to green jobs will work. And then there's this one other big hurdle standing in the way of transitioning large numbers of defense workers into green jobs, getting the contractors out of the way and on board. Miriam thinks it's possible. What would it take to start sort of shifting the way that we do things?
When you spend this massively on the military enterprise, they have no incentive to try to do anything else. It's not enough to cut. We have to reinvest into civilian areas that will become what economists call demand pull. So creating enough incentive to move the contractors to look into other markets by creating those other markets by investing on the civilian side of the budget. What we really need is a new industrial policy.
As in a government effort to support certain strategically important industries. That's an idea that some analysts say might actually be making a comeback post-pandemic.
Industrial policy has always been a taboo subject in most U.S. circles. This is communism, this is government-planned economy. But in fact, we do have one industrial policy, and that is a military industrial policy. And what we need is a new national mission to take the place of our military forces as the only area in which the government really plans everything and invests more heavily by far than in any other area.
But defense contractors aren't always up to the task of transitioning on their own. So, to give them a hand, Miriam says introducing some government incentives could go a long way. Specifically, incentives that support strategic partnerships between civilian and defense contractors. It's not a totally radical idea. There's a fairly recent precedent from the early 90s when reducing defense spending was a top priority.
The flagship conversion project of the post-Cold War period was something called the Technology Reinvestment Project.
The president announced the Technology Reinvestment Project last March outside a Westinghouse plant in Baltimore. Right away, things went into high gear and began to happen quickly.
It teamed up defense contractors and commercial contractors and the national labs and unions and a big consortium of people. They got substantial grants to commercialize defense technology. And the hardest hit place in the country was Southern California, where the aerospace industry was strongest, and contractors all over Southern California were having their contracts cut. There were massive layoffs. And at the same time, Southern California was drowning in smog. To solve all of these problems, there was an effort to create something called CalSTART, which was a public-private partnership.
Today, it is my honor to announce that our Department of Transportation is going to give to CalSTART, a consortium of California companies, $3.4 million to help them start building electric cars for the future of America.
The idea was we are going to create an electric car industry in Southern California that is going to solve our smog problem. And also, we are going to be re-employing laid-off aerospace workers in building electric cars. So there's a documentary some people may have seen called Who Killed the Electric Car?
Even as car companies made electric cars, they fought them at every step. What was their motive? Why were they so determined to take them off the road?
Mainly it was the opposition of the car makers. They weren't willing to do that back then. So that initiative foundered for a while, but it has kept going. And now CalSTART is this major operation that has extended beyond California. It's also working internationally. It works with the state to fund initiatives. They're working on electrifying the fleet of heavy trucks.
CalSTART showed that the partnership model is a winning idea. But Miriam says there haven't been a lot of other attempts to replicate it.
It's so frustrating. I've been doing this for years, looking for examples, and the incentives are all in the opposite direction. And inertia, keep doing what we're doing, is just really powerful.
In the largest sense, whether defense transition happens or not is really up to what our lawmakers choose to fund. But changes, they can come from the ground up, too.
Connecticut is a highly defense-dependent state. It builds nuclear submarines and the F-35 and helicopters and all of those things. But the workers working on the F-35 have all sorts of skills that are now ready to be used on, for example, the big offshore wind project off the coast of New England. The Machinists Union, they've just won a labor agreement that says that it'll be required that they are built by union labor. And so that's a big victory for the unions there, and also for the idea that these workers can, with certain retraining, be put to work building things we actually need.
You could be building windmills and small hydropower with these same kinds of
by investing in clean energy, infrastructure, healthcare, and education.
Building a hybrid electric bus.
Water and wastewater treatment are really, really exciting.
How do we make our energy infrastructure resilient and reliable against climate threats, cyber threats, and
we need to have a balance of defense and making sure that we have energy security, making sure that the way that we are producing our energy is not harming and polluting our environment.
Things That Go Boom is produced by Inkstick Media and distributed by PRX. This episode was produced by Emily Vaughn and me, and edited by Ruth Morris, Katie Toth, and Layla Ujali. Darian Schulman writes the music for our show, and Robin Wise makes everything sound shiny and new. A huge extra thanks this week to Taylor. You can find more of her reporting on the Asheville Raytheon deal and follow the rest of her reporting on Twitter at TK Barnes. You can also go on over and follow us at Inkstick Media, or just me at Lacey. And remember, we always love it if you leave us a nice review. Thank you, as always, to the foundations that make our work possible, the Carnegie Corporation of New York and Plowshares Fund, as well as Inkstick supporters, including the Cologne Foundation, Craig Newmark Foundation, Prospect Hill Foundation, and the Jubitz Family Foundation. And thank you to all of you for supporting our show. We'll see you right back here in 2 weeks.
I also have a big mouthful to talk about or why the journalism industry as it is not equipped to cover the military-industrial complex.
Oh.
I mean, basically, if you're looking for any journalism job that has the word defense industry, defense in it, it's going to be based in Washington with a Pentagon press conference.
Funded by the defense industry, usually.
Absolutely, absolutely. There needs to be a better way to independently report on the military-industrial complex in all the variety of locations where it's manifested.
You and I need to raise some money, and you need to start reporting for Inkstick.
Emily.
Emily's saying, is there a solution to this? There's a solution. Any billionaire listeners want to reach out.
I know. I am willing to take your phone call.
We have got some reporting for you.